had been married to David for almost 6 months when I noticed the strange occurrences in his house. You know, creaking in the hallway, scratching in the walls, all the usual creepy things you'd expect from a horror movie. Despite all these things, however, David never seemed to be bothered by them, nor would he ever wish to speak about them with me. Much to my chagrin. So one night I had decided to wake David up in the middle of the night, so he too could hear the sounds for once rather than sleeping through them. I laid in bed for, maybe an hour after David fell asleep, and then the noise started. Scratch, scratch. I heard from the wall behind the headboard.
David,
I hissed.
wake up!
I frantically shook him until his eyes finally opened. What? He asked in the groggiest voice imaginable. Just as David spoke aloud, the sound stopped, and I briefly heard a frustrated hiss from above me, in the attic. What is it? Asked David as he buried his face into the pillow. Listen, shaking in fear as goosebumps ran up and down my arms, legs, and torso. However, by then the noise had come to a complete halt. I don't hear anything, murmured David. Just get back to sleep. I've got work at 6, he grumbled before he quickly nodded off back to sleep, although I couldn't. Not after that sharp hiss of frustration I heard from the attic. I continued to lie in the darkness as I waited for another sound to resonate from the walls or the ceiling. I was just praying it wouldn't come from outside our bedroom door. Eventually, just as the sun began to rise outside our bedroom window, I managed to drift off back to sleep. When I eventually awoke at 1 in the afternoon, I heard David downstairs in the kitchen, likely cooking breakfast as he usually did. But as I got out of bed to go and greet him, something odd came to mind. It was 1 p.m. David started work at 6 a.m. I don't know why, but my heart practically stopped in my chest. It wouldn't have been logical to assume David had gone home early and decided to make dinner, or that work canceled on him, or that he had gotten the day off. But instead of thinking rational thoughts, my brain was racked with the thoughts of the previous night, of something listening to us in the walls and ceiling, of the possibility of someone living in our house without our knowledge. I don't know how long I stood frozen in my bedroom with the door shut before I eventually heard the sounds from downstairs cease. I slowly crept over to my phone and put it on silent before ringing David. He didn't pick up, however. He could have been busy making food, or maybe he was in a meeting and had turned his phone off. Either way, I was not going to be getting any confirmation of David's whereabouts. When I decided to combat the horrific feeling in my stomach, and I stepped out of the bedroom and onto the land with just a short corridor leading to the stairs going down into the living room and kitchen, with a few deep breaths and shaking like an autumn leaf on its last day. I slowly forced my legs to carry me down the stairs. I stared down the stairs into the brightly lit living room, but the kitchen was still out of my line of sight. I slowly crept down the stairs as I heard a strange sound. Humming. An almost feminine humming. But it was so wrong, so inhuman. I crept around the corner at the bottom of the stairs and looked into the brightly lit kitchen to see myself. It was just standing there in my pajamas making food, or so it appeared from the awkward side angle I had on myself, but its face was anything but my own. It had similar features, but it was soaked in black bile, and everything about the face was so odd and disproportionate. Before it could spot me, I held my breath and retreated back upstairs, only to end up on the damn creaking floorboard, The humming stopped and my heart began racing. I dropped the stealthy act and sprinted up to my bedroom where I locked the door and called 911. Lydia? An eerie and distorted version of my own voice called through the window door. Come out. Its sing-songy tone only made me more frenetic as I finally patched through to an operator, and I just immediately began screaming for the police. They reassured me everything would be okay, just as the thing started banging on the door. I waited for what felt like forever, listening to that horrific variant of myself singing to me to come out of the room. Every time it would try to turn the door handle, my heart would skip a beat, and somehow even more goosebumps would layer over my skin. It took almost an hour before the police finally showed up. The thing stopped making noise as it disappeared into the house. This is the police! I faintly heard downstairs, but I downright refused to exit my bedroom. I instead sat, just curled in a ball. My arms wrapped around my legs. I waited and heard the door downstairs smash open as 2 or 3 police officers ran around the downstairs before they came up and knocked on my door. Ma'am? The voice asked. I got up and timidly unlocked the door before peeking out. Thankfully, the officer looked and sounded perfectly normal. You have to help me, was all I could mutter out as my vision frantically darted all over the corridor leading to the attic doorway. What is it? Asked the officer. Ma'am? It looked like me, I mumbled, tears mostly streaming down my face from the fear. The officer didn't say anything as his eyes followed the direction mine were pointing, directly at the attic. The officer called downstairs for the other officers and investigated the attic, but found nothing. They then did a very thorough search of the entire house and found nothing. Despite my protests, the officers left as soon as my husband returned home. I even heard one of them tell me to get me checked out at a hospital. After the police departed, I immediately questioned David on what I saw, but he claimed that he had never seen anything like that and instead claimed I had been watching too many scary movies and haven't been acting myself lately. It didn't take long for David to force me to visit a psychologist, just in case I did imagine it. They tried to prescribe me antipsychotics of all things, even though I know what I saw was real. I haven't heard anything in the walls since my last doctor's visit, but now instead of hearing things, I'm feeling them. Like 1,000 pairs of eyes, always watching me at the darkest hours of the night. Have you ever been so scared that you felt sick? Like physically sick from fear? Well, that's how I felt when I looked into my kitchen and saw something trying to be me. Its features were distorted and its voice was unnatural. I don't know how I escaped, but I did, and I don't feel safe. I'll never feel safe, not again. Following my encounter with my deformed doppelganger, I started to suffer from constant night terrors, waking up in the night feeling the stare of something. My husband, David, eventually convinced me to see a psychologist who prescribed me with several medications intended to prevent my night terrors and the paranoia. Although I avoided taking them for quite some time, in the end I gave in and I took them just to appease David's nagging, but it didn't help. If anything, it made me feel less safe, being drugged up and unable to defend myself. After almost 3 months of terrifying nightmares and fears of that thing coming to get me. David and I moved out of his house and began renting a nice apartment further into the city, away from the house, and thankfully closer to David's work. Finally, I could sleep again without waking up from the feeling of something staring at me. But my relationship with David even started improving, and we even started trying to have kids. But despite everything going well in our lives, I still remember that thing's face, its voice, everything about it. One morning, I awoke and felt very nauseous. It wasn't only after I ate that I threw up. I took one of the pregnancy tests that we had bought, and I was pregnant. I had to wait for David to come home, but he was ecstatic, and the second he heard about it. This joy, however, would quickly turn tail that very night as I lay in bed, wrapped up beside David. My eyes were suddenly drawn to the vent in the wall. Easily the cause of many episodes of paranoia, and it would be the cause of yet another one. I rolled over and snuggled onto David, a fruitless endeavor due to him sleeping on his stomach. However, I felt it again. That feeling of being watched. Every hair on the back of my neck started to stand on end as I attempted to ignore it. A brief and barely audible hiss came from somewhere in the room. I froze in horror as goosebumps shot up my spine, gripping onto David as I held him as tight as I possibly could. David, I gently whispered, tears in my eyes from the sheer memories of that thing. He didn't move. David. My voice quivered as I shook him gently. He mumbled as his eyes slowly opened to greet mine. Shh. I stared at him, wide-eyed and filled with fear. What is it? David thankfully whispered. I think there's something in here with us. I trembled as I felt the tears run down my face and onto the pillow, soaking it beneath me. David slowly and gently got onto his side and wrapped his arms around me in a loving embrace. It's okay, babe. I felt somewhat safer as he held me, and somehow I even drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up still in David's arms, something I was thankful for as I snuggled into his warm hold. After about 20 minutes, his alarm went off and he set off for work while I went into the living room to watch some TV. As I watched, however, I heard a metallic scraping sound from above me. Maybe in the vents running through the apartment complex. Crap, I grumbled to myself before returning to watch TV and drinking tea. The scrapes continued and quickly started to get on my nerves as I stood up and stormed into my bedroom to investigate. The scraping continued and quickly started to get on my nerves as I stood up and stormed into my bedroom to investigate the vent. I let out a sigh as I picked up the screwdriver from the bedside table and which I used it to move the cold metal plate over the vent. Using the flashlight on my phone, I peered down only to recoil out of the vent in horror. It was me, with the same deformed features, wearing that same pajamas all those months ago. It crawled out like a snake, slithering through the nearby ventilation shafts. Knowing it was the only way into the apartment besides the front door, I quickly and shakily screwed the hatch back on before frantically dragging and pushing the tall dresser in front of it, sealing it up to the best of my ability. I felt my organs move aside to make my way for the vomit, but alas, it never came, and I was left with a horrible feeling in my stomach and the knowledge that it was after me again, trying to take my form and steal my life from me again. It would never pass for me, I reasoned with myself. It looks too unnatural, I thought as I was pacing to release the buildup of energy. I grabbed my phone and immediately phoned David. Yeah, David's voice thankfully poured through my phone. David, it's here. It's that thing Hun, I'm at work. Just take your meds and try to calm down. Stress isn't good for the baby, he warned before he hung up. Damn it. I growled in fear and frustration. I threw my phone to one side and ran to the front door to make certain it was locked. It was, thank heaven. I continued to pace around the apartment for God knows how long until David returned home with a briefcase full of paperwork that would keep him busy into the long night. Before long, me and David were back to arguing just like before we moved. I don't think I've ever screamed quite as loud as anyone in my entire life. Certainly woke up the neighbors with our yelling. Soon after the argument, I stormed off to bed and immediately wrapped myself up and tried to get some sleep before a strange thought came to my head. The dresser. The dresser had moved. I shined my torch at the dresser and the now wide open vent. Oh crap, was all I could squeeze out before I heard something approaching the bedroom door. Lydia. David's voice called through. I'm sorry about our argument. Can I come in? Door's unlocked, I mumbled. David entered and immediately looked at the vent, and my heart sank as I saw my doppelganger appear behind him. It dragged him away, and kicking and screaming by the ankles, the lights in the apartment all went out simultaneously, leaving me blind in the abysmal darkness. I screamed David's name as I fumbled in the dark before shining my light into the living room to see the mimicker changing form. It used its clawed hands to tear away at the flesh intended to look like me and gargled and grunted, its shape slowly starting to resemble a grown, well-built man. I remember the sound of its individual teeth falling out to make way for new ones. While it was distracted with its metamorphosis, I sprinted back to the bedroom and shakily opened the window. I heard the creature stop groaning.
Lydia?
David's distorted voice softly spoke from behind me. Before I could process anything, I felt it grab me from behind. I instinctively grabbed the screwdriver from the bedside table and drove it into the impersonator's face, causing it to let me go. It had taken the appearance of David, though he looked hideous. His eyes were abnormally large and his mouth was hanging agape, wider than any mouth should be able to do as it drooled black mucus. Without a second thought, I threw myself out of the window and onto the cold metal balcony stairwell. I sprinted down the flight of steps before dropping down, twisting my ankle in the process. I only got away with the help of my neighbor, Frank, who discreetly got me to the hospital. I tried to report my husband's death to the police, only to be shocked that David Noble is perfectly fine and living in his apartment. I knew it wasn't him. Not anymore. Rather than tell them that the monster had been hunting me for what felt like years now, I instead decided to rather quietly move away from David and the apartment. It's been 2 years since the mimicker took David's form. I've been living alone with my son. His name is Trenton. Since David's death, I don't know what the thing wanted, but it has not haunted me since. perhaps it was simply after David's visage rather than my own. Now that creature lives in our apartment. It goes to David's place of work, and it generally lives David's life. It's perfected David's appearance from what little I can gather the few times I've driven past. It's done much better than it did with my form. I don't know what will come next in my life. David's gone, but I still have Trent and what little remains of my paranoia-driven psyche. But if it comes for me or my son, I will find a way to kill it. Mark my words.